Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Mina Bose. If you've heard me introduce myself several times, this is getting boring. But if you haven't, just to be clear, I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and the Director of the Peter S. Calico Center for the Study of the American Presidency in the Calico School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs at Hofstra University. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today for our concluding panel on what has been a most instructive day under the theme American Constitutionalism at 250, referencing the semi-quincentennial of the Declaration of Independence this year. How will the past inform the future? I have to tell you, I said this earlier this morning, and I think I want to mention it again. I'd like to mention it again here. I'd like to give special thanks to my colleague, Dr. Carolyn Eisenberg, who is in the History Department, a member of the Calico Center Faculty Advisory Council, who developed the idea for this program in the fall and has been working with others, but this really was Rusty's idea. So thank you, Rusty, for doing this. Much appreciated. And organized this panel in particular, which is probably one of the most significant topics, I would say, in American politics today, looking at executive power and unalienable rights with particular reference to immigration policy. The theme of the panel is No Kings, 1776 to 2026. I will turn it over to my colleague to make the formal introductions. Please join me in welcoming the group. Thank you.
Okay, is my microphone working? I've been trying for 20 years to learn how to do that, and I'm not there yet. So I'm really delighted to be in this panel. It's really been a very, very interesting day, and I feel like this is an opportunity to learn about things that maybe many of us don't know all that much about. But throughout American history, when we've talked about unalienable rights, it's always been clear that there are groups that are excluded from that, and that there's been a harshness in our society toward different groups of people, off and on as part of our history. But we'll be interested to see what the speakers have to say about this. But I think this is one of the most harsh periods that I can ever remember in my lifetime, in terms of the way our own people inside our own country have been treated. And one thing that I'm curious about is also how our speakers see the present period in the context of what came before the Donald Trump era. So I'm not going to take any more time. Just want to introduce both of them. And I think they will speak first with clinical professor Lauris Wren, who is the founder and director of the Asylum Clinic here at Hofstra, as well as director of clinical programs. Through the Asylum Clinic, law students represent applicants for asylum, people who have fled their countries because of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. The clinic's clients come from around the world, and they face very serious obstacles in their application for survival. This clinic here at Hofstra has represented hundreds of immigrants and has had a 100% success rate in their cases. Professor Wren is also the director of the LGBTQ Fellowship at Hofstra Law, and back in 2014, she founded the LGBT Immigrants of Long Island, the first organization on Long Island specifically serving lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender immigrants. One of the things I'm always very conscious of is this tremendous concern now about students and where you're going to get a job. I'm sure many of you have had that worry brought to your attention. Where are you going to get a job? And how much money are you going to make in the job? And it's always good to be reminded that there are many jobs in which you can do worlds of good for other people. And in some ways, that's the most satisfying thing at all. And both of our speakers today are part of that experience. Professor Wren will be followed by Nadia Marin Molina, who is co-director of the National Day Labor Organizing Network here in Long Island. And she's brought years of experience in the struggle for immigrant workers' rights. She created and led that organization's disaster response initiative to successfully train thousands of day laborers and build the capacity of that network's member organizations. She's also spearheaded programs to protect the health of nail salon workers and to prosecute criminal construction contracts while at the New York Committee for Occupational Safety and Health. She received national coverage for her work as executive director at the Workplace Project, fighting hate groups and anti-immigrant legislation here on Long Island. We're very, very fortunate to have her with us today. And again, I think both of these people, as I look at their careers and the activities that they have, are a model for how you can have a life that really involves advancing social justice and helping individual people. So I'm going to ask Professor Wren to speak first, and to be followed by Nadia Marin Molina second. And then each of them will speak for about 15 minutes apiece. And then I think we'll open the floor for an exchange of views and questions from students. And I would say all day we've had great questions from students. And it's really made for a conversation that's really been very valuable. So let me turn things over to Professor Wren.
So, as Professor Eisenberg mentioned, I'm an immigration attorney with a specialty in asylum. So that response to that at this point in time should be gasping and a little closer. The response to that should be gasping in horror and putting your hand over your heart in sympathy, because it is a cruel world right now, and terrible injustice that primarily our clients, but also myself and my students are dealing with it on a daily basis. Immigration practice today is totally different than it was 2 years ago. The constant fear that immigrants who have followed every rule, who have never had a problem with the law, who are simply waiting for their hearing date or waiting for their interview date, and we are trying to get that hearing or interview date as soon as possible, sometimes even going into federal court to get them to order immigration to give us a hearing date, that person may be picked up and detained, usually unlawfully, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but also for no reason. You know, they want to go to immigration, they want to have their hearing. The only reason that they're being picked up and being held in reprehensible conditions, we've had 47 deaths in ICE detention during this presidential term, is to try to force them to give up and leave. There have always been some problems in immigration, but this is the first time where I think most immigration attorneys do not believe they have much of a chance of getting a just hearing for their clients. So totally different. But our immigration law, the statute, immigration and nationality law, which is our basic immigration statute, has not changed at all. You know, the Congress has not made any laws that are different. All of the changes have come from executive actions or executive policies coming down through executive agencies. Before I start going into this in more detail, I just want to mention about my clients that one of the truly infuriating things to be faced with all the time are the intentional lies about who it is who is being detained. My clients are amazing people. They are some of the best people I've met in my life. They're people who faced horrible persecution in their country and were forced out. And it's a constant inspiration for me to see my clients who have been through such terrible circumstances and who themselves are still very profoundly good people who try to help everyone around them. There are people who have maintained hope in spite of having all these horrific situations. They're here trying to start a new life. You don't try to start a new life if you are not hopeful. For me, that speaks very deeply of the resilience of the human spirit, and that is truly inspirational to me. And actually, people often ask me when I'm doing talks, how do you keep going in this environment? And honestly, part of it is that I feel if my clients who have been through so much more than I have been through are able still to be hopeful, then I can't be lazy and give up hope. The vast majority of people in immigration detention have zero criminal contact. 70% have no criminal convictions. They are arresting people and detaining them for no legitimate law enforcement purpose. These are not generally people who have tried to avoid immigration. These are people being arrested if they go to a court hearing or an ICE check-in. Well, if they're going to their court hearing, they're showing up. They're not trying to hide. It's absurd to arrest people. And I will also just add, we're spending $14 billion a year now on immigration detention. Immigration detention has always been staggeringly expensive. It's way more expensive now. But other than trying to brutalize people and force them to give up what they have the right to do, there is no real purpose of the immigration detention for the vast majority of people being detained. So I want to go back to a little review, which I'm sure you all know, that the U.S. Constitution for separation of powers assigned lawmaking powers to Congress in Article 1 and law execution to the President in Article 2, Section 3. So very basically, we should all know as Americans, and hopefully you covered this in grade school, that Congress is supposed to make the laws and the President and executive agencies are supposed to enforce them. So then comes the question of, okay, so how has Trump and the executive branch more broadly been able to wreak havoc in our immigration system if they are not Congress making laws? And there are many answers to that. Trump has been extraordinarily active in issuing executive orders or executive actions. There's also just generally policy directives. In his first year of this term, so in 2025, I think he issued maybe 225 to 250 executive orders. And I don't think another president, I looked this up, I think I will remember it. I don't think that another president has exceeded 100 executive orders in the first term of a presidency since 1945, when Harry Truman did, because he had a lot of post-World War II issues that were going on. So this is a huge increase in issuing executive orders. And of course, the problem with executive orders is that it's not Congress. Executive orders are just the president saying, this is the law, this is the law. They do carry the weight of law, but executive orders should be only deal with what are actually executive functions. They should not be making laws. So now when you look at the executive orders, or if you look at the other policy directives that Trump is giving that is impacting immigration so much, and I will say, by the way, this is in so many areas of law, not just immigration. It's just that we're focused on immigration. But a huge amount of law has been changed in many, many areas simply through the president saying this is what the law should be, which is not how we're supposed to make laws. So some of the orders and directives that are given are on their face unlawful. They can be challenged in court, but I'm going to discuss a little bit later that even where they are successfully challenged in court, they're still very, very harmful often. So a very obvious example of this is the executive order on his first day in office in 2025, the Protecting the Meaning and Value of American Citizenship, which would have made children of undocumented immigrants and other people on some temporary visas ineligible for citizenship. So we have a Constitution. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution guarantees birthright citizenship. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state where they reside. There has been well over 100 years of jurisprudence in the Supreme Court about whether children who are born to foreign-born parents who don't have status in the United States, whether those children are citizens, and the answer is yes. So we have literally the Constitution and hundreds of years of precedent from the Supreme Court. And on the first day of his term, President Trump tried to trump that with an executive order. And that would have been almost inconceivable at another time in history. That, first off, the idea that you would attack birthright citizenship itself, only the most extreme of the fringe would make those arguments. And second, that a president would try to override the Constitution with an executive order. Still shocks me. But unfortunately, once it happens, it's less shocking to people. It no longer seems like an inconceivable thing. The goalposts have moved in a way that is very harmful for our society. Now, all of the district courts overruled against Trump on this, and many of them were absolutely outraged at it. So I pulled a couple quotes, but I'm only going to read from one. A Reagan appointee, and this was across the board, whoever had Trump appointees, Biden appointees, Reagan, Bush appointees, everybody. This is District Judge John Coffenor, who said, citizenship by birth is an unequivocal constitutional right. It is one of the precious principles that makes the United States the great nation that it is. The president cannot change, limit, or qualify this constitutional right via an executive order. And he said in other parts of his decision, I've been on the bench for over 4 decades. I can't remember another case where the question presented is as clear as this one. This is a blatantly unconstitutional order. There are moments in the world's history where people look back and ask, where were the lawyers? Where were the judges? In these moments, the rule of law becomes especially vulnerable. I refuse to let that beacon go dark today. It has become ever more apparent that to our president, the rule of law is but an impediment to his policy goals. The rule of law is, according to him, something to navigate around or simply ignore, whether that be for political or personal gain. Nevertheless, in this courtroom and under my watch, the rule of law is a bright beacon which I intend to follow. This is a conservative judge. This is not, this is not, I feel like if I say this is not an Obama appointee, I'm going to suggest that all Obama appointees were liberal, and I don't want to suggest that. But this is someone appointed by a fairly conservative Republican, or when he was elected, what would be considered a fairly conservative Republican. The Supreme Court, I feel very confident, will rule against Trump on this. There were arguments earlier this month, but at least 2 judges are going to rule for him. And the fact that 2 judges are going to rule that this executive order should take precedence over the Constitution and over 100 years of Supreme Court law Again, we're talking about moving the goalposts, about what seems possible, what seems normal. So I guess one thing I'm saying to you is even our victories, like, so this will be a victory, of course it will be, if and when the Supreme Court rules that this order is unconstitutional. But the fight itself harms us. The fact that this happened harms us. I also, the Supreme Court didn't smack it down like it should have right at the start. It ruled for Trump on a procedural matter earlier on regarding injunctions, which just lent credence to this idea and also meant that maybe in some states, undocumented people who had children, maybe their kids wouldn't become citizens. And one of the things is a lot of this is about creating fear. So did this create fear? Yes, it did. And the longer it went on without being firmly slapped down, the more fear it created. The other thing that happens, and this is an intentional act often, is death by paper cut. So saying, we don't want injunctions, you have to file separately in each state or something like that, which is more or less what happened with the procedural ruling. What that means is that the organizations who do this work, who are already stretched way too thin, instead of filing one case, have to file 50 different cases. And that is an intentional strategy by this administration that they do all the time to immigration attorneys. We're going to make this application not 4 pages, but 27 pages, and we're going to reject it for no reason 6 times before we accept it, because if they've made me work on something, 6 times instead of once, if I'm a private attorney, I have to charge more money to my clients. And if I'm in a nonprofit, which fortunately for me I am, I can take fewer clients, because this has sucked up 6 times more time than it should have sucked up. So it's an intentional strategy. I want to point out other unlawful, one other unlawful act and just talk about the consequences of that. Warrantless arrests that are happening all the time. They're not allowed to do it in the vast majority of situations. Only if the they have probable cause to believe that the person is in the U.S. illegally and the person is likely to escape if they don't do an arrest right then and there. Well, think of all these arrests in courthouses, and in ICE check-ins. These are people who came in when called. So they're not trying to escape. There is no reason not to have a warrant in that situation if you're going to arrest somebody. When people arrest, and I already mentioned the hideous conditions in detention, when a person is arrested unlawfully, to get them out, what attorneys are generally having to do is file a petition for writ of habeas corpus. We've been successful, and I'm speaking broadly as immigration attorneys. Immigration attorneys have been successful in about 97% of those cases. So the judges are overwhelmingly agreeing that this is unlawful detention, that this person shouldn't be held. But most of the people in detention can't afford an attorney to file a writ of mandamus. Nonprofits are overstretched. We will for our own clients. There's no way we're taking on more clients. So it means that a little tiny sliver of people who are able to get an attorney will get out of detention, but all the others won't. So I go back to the wins in court. Yes, they're super important. But the unlawful action that has happened often for unrepresented people, or even people who are represented, but the additional money it would cost them to file this that they just don't have, are still being hurt, and it still turns the immigration world upside down. And this is just like the slightest sliver of all the harm that is being done. But I want to hand it over to my colleague to share her perspectives.
Great. Thank you. That was really informative, I think, for those of us who don't work in that area, to just get this kind of overview of the situation.
All right. So I know it's a lot of information, and I think that one of the things that I hope to do is to take some of exactly what Professor Wren is talking about and kind of bring it to here, right? Bring it locally, so that you also see how some of those issues are happening here on Long Island and other parts of the country as well. But I think it's easiest to understand and grasp some of what we see happening here. So I want to go through first. I'm here on behalf of NDLON, which is the National Day Labor Organizing Network. I want to explain a little bit about what that is, who day laborers are, so that you know, and then get into the current situation, how it's manifesting here on Long Island, and then also some of what we're doing and what we're asking people to do, right? To talk about what's going on and what actions we can take, because we think it's important to also know that we can take action. There are things that can be done that make a difference. So first, going back to who are day laborers, our organization is a national network that was created with different local worker centers who are working with day laborers. And day laborers in Spanish is jornaleros, have been part of the country for all of its history. They're workers who are looking for work out in the Home Depots or 7-Elevens. Generally, they go out to work and don't really know what's coming that day, right? Like they might end up with a job in landscaping and painting and demolition, any of those, right? If a truck pulls up, they'll see what the wage is and they'll go to work, right? They're trying to get a job done, and trying to earn money for their families or to pay their rent. And here on Long Island, there have been efforts where people say, well, they're just loitering out there, and so they try to create legislation to get rid of day laborers, to legislate them out of existence. And we always want to make clear that, no matter what Fox News is saying, day laborers are not here to commit any kind of crime. They're here to work. And in general, that's what immigrants in general are also doing. They're looking for jobs, they're looking for ways to sustain their family and have a lot of that hope that you were talking about, right? It's love and hope for their families, which made them make that very rational decision to come here to the United States, traveling thousands of miles to figure out where the jobs are and how they can support themselves. One example that we think is always good to mention is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass's first job after escaping to freedom was as a day laborer in New Bedford, Massachusetts. He was shoveling coal and he was working on ships on his way to become a journalist, an abolitionist, and a great orator in the United States. And so, day labor we consider is historically important work as well. And so our organization is also challenging the idea that day laborers and immigrant workers are impossible to organize. We've had that. People have said that to us directly. And our organizations are saying, no, it is possible to build power from the bottom up. It is possible to organize. They've established worker centers that have established minimum wages to stop a race to the bottom from employers, defending labor standards, pushing for better health and safety conditions, getting job training. All of that stuff are things that workers do when they come together and that organizations are able to foster. Language classes, daycare, all of that are things that workers together can build. and do build together. And another thing that we always emphasize with regard to day laborers is that day laborers stand up for their rights, right? The right to stand on a street corner and look for work is a constitutionally protected right. It's a First Amendment right, so that all of us have that right. And day laborers have fought to defend that right in court. And standing on that a corner to solicit work is protected speech. And when day laborers or other immigrant workers are defending those rights and win those court battles, they're winning those battles for all of us, right? And similarly with Fourth Amendment rights, which we'll talk about later, the rights to be protected from unconstitutional searches and seizures, day laborers and other immigrants are also defending that right. And in defending those rights, they're defending, again, all of our rights. I will also mention that day laborers are part of the big box economy, right? The Home Depot economy, where employers or contractors go and pick up, materials, and they're also able to hire workers there. That benefits the workers, but it also benefits Home Depot. And it has worked this way at this point for decades. So all of this is what day laborers are doing. And when they go to the corners, they're also facing the risk, right? The risk of exploitation, the risk of not being paid, the risk of going to a job that is extraordinarily dangerous without any health and safety protection. And all of those things were issues or have been issues before. And now, under this Trump administration, now we're hitting a whole new series of issues. And I think we're also safe to say that what we're living through, what we're all living through, is worse than any of us had imagined. It's definitely worse than the situation is worse than what we've seen before, but it's also worse than we had imagined. It's a calamity for day laborers and for immigrants in general. The random arrests on the streets, the way that the Trump administration has targeted day labor in particular, right, with Stephen Miller telling DHS and ICE agents and saying when they weren't getting enough workers, right, when they weren't arresting, when he didn't think that the arrests were high enough, saying, why don't you go to the Home Depots? Why aren't you going to the 7-Elevens, right? Because he knows that's where they can find people of brown skin easily, right? And so it's been very clear that that's what's happening. We've seen it, we've all seen it, right, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Minnesota, but it's also, now getting here, it's also in Hempstead, it's in Huntington, it's in Hicksville. I watched while ICE here, in Hicksville in particular, held an entire house hostage for hours. There were parents, children, and neighbors who were there. They stood out with guns and with a camera, right? With cameras, because they had their own camera crew to cover what they're doing, so they could publicize it later. Disgustingly, and they basically held that house hostage, demanding that one person that they were looking for turn themselves in, and saying that if that person didn't turn themselves in, they were going to arrest everybody, the whole family. Eventually, that person did turn themselves in. But that's exactly what is happening. With the Homeland Security budget, which has been increasing, I think it was tripled in the last budget, and then they gave the additional, I think it's $75 billion, right, that they gave to ICE in the, I hate to say, like, big, beautiful bill, because I hate it, but that's what it was known as.
Big ugly bill.
Yes, exactly, the big ugly bill. They gave all that money for troops, for vehicles, for weapons, for detention cells, for whatever they want, right? And I always, because I've worked for so long on workers' rights issues, I always like to compare that, I think, because you say, well, it's a big amount of money, that's the government. They deal in large amounts of money. But compare that, and that's the increase. That $75 billion is the increase. The entire budget of the U.S. Department of Labor, that includes the Wage and Hour Division, it includes OSHA, it includes their sort of job workforce development, the whole U.S. Department of Labor, which is supposed to cover every single workplace in the United States, their entire budget is $7 billion. So that's a tenth of what the budget that ICE has. The increase in budget that ICE has, exactly. So coming back to Long Island, I want to mention that one of the ways that we're seeing executive power here is that there's a program called 287G, which is that number for the section of federal immigration law that created it. It allows basically the federal government to delegate immigration enforcement to local authorities on the streets and jails. And this is how the Trump administration takes that power and extends it. It's like, try to explain it, it's like an octopus, with tentacles that are going everywhere, right? And those tentacles are reaching into states, into cities, into villages. And so every time there's a police encounter, a traffic stop, any kind of interaction between a community member and one of those entities, immigration is looking at that, right? Obviously, it's bad for public safety. People who are afraid to talk with the police are not going to report crimes or serve as witnesses. It's bad for everybody, right? For the community as a whole. We have in Nassau County, we have two 287G agreements. One which is the police and ICE, Nassau County Police, so they have a certain number of detectives that are basically assigned to work as ICE agents. And there's a sheriff's agreement, which is that in the Nassau County Jail, in the correction center, there are 50 beds, 50 slots set aside for immigration detainees to be brought there to be used. They keep them short amounts of time, so it's relatively small, but they cycle a lot of people through there. And meanwhile, our county executive, Bruce Blakeman, is obviously, is using the narrative, right, of crime. He puts out social media posts with pictures of young Latino men who are arrested, and saying, well, these are the criminals. These people might end up being deported before any trial on the crime that they may or may not have committed is actually happens. So that means there's no evidence, there's no due process, right? There's nothing. It's just they are their pictures are used for political propaganda. That's more or less what's happening. I'll also mention that, and you should stop me if I'm going on for too long. I just have a couple more things. Santos,
they're important.
Am I okay? Okay. Santos Vanegas Reyes was a day laborer who lived in Hempstead and was arrested on September 18th in front of on the back of the Key Food supermarket in Hempstead. It was one of those arrests where I'll get into that in a minute, but he was brought to the Nassau County Jail under this 287G agreement. By 6:30, it was around 12 noon that he was arrested. By 6:30 the next morning, he was found dead in his cell in the Nassau County Jail. And until now, there is no clarity as to what happened or why. ICE always, you'll see this over and over again, blames the victim, blames that person, right, for his own death. But we're saying there needs to be an autopsy. We need to know publicly. There needs to be transparency about what happened. They're saying that he was sick, that he had alcohol poisoning. But if that's true, he was not given the treatment that you need to be given in order to not die, right? If you have that. That's another example. Hempstead in particular, we have seen collaboration between ICE and the local village police as well. So one thing is Nassau County, another thing is Hempstead Police, right? There's a Hempstead mayor and Hempstead Police. We have seen, right, there are witnesses, there are rapid response groups and committees, which I'll talk about in a minute. We've seen those arrests, which are clear violations of the Fourth Amendment. It's racial profiling. It's just, picking people up randomly in the street. And the way that somebody who's arrested is brought into to the armory, which is a local police building. We are pushing in Hempstead for an executive order or an ordinance, some kind of local legislation that would prohibit, right, ICE from using any of those local resources. So anyway, I know I went through all of that stuff. I think we and many are saying we need to organize, right? This is what's happening. Yes, it's a difficult time, but we do need to have that hope that we can change things. We always say, solo el pueblo salva el pueblo, which means only the people save the people. And what that means is we don't sit around waiting for, I don't know, some politician, for another county executive, for example. We can't sit around waiting for that, right? We need to take whatever action we can to change things. And there are many things that we can do. We've put out trainings around something we call Adopt a Corner, which is basically we've been training people to make connections with day laborers in their area. That's one way of working. We've had thousands of people take those trainings. I mentioned rapid response, right? And ICE Watch, that's something that's going. Even patronizing some of the local immigrant businesses rather than going, I go to 7-Eleven or Dunkin' Donuts, but there's a ton of, local immigrant businesses. There's Mi Tierrita, and there's a bunch of locations. It's actually, they've been organizing too, and we've had some good coverage here from the Long Island Advocate, which I will mention, and thank you as Hofstra for the coverage, which was then, it's also been picked up in Newsday, the issue of how the businesses have reported losses due to all of these raids. The businesses have reported losses of 50, 60%, in some cases even 90% of their income because of the people who are staying home and not walking around in the village of Hempstead. And so the last thing that I will mention, and the most important thing of all, is that we are organizing for May 1st. So we invite you and ask all of you to join us on May 1st here in Hempstead. You all know, I think, or may have heard that it's International Workers' Day. And that's, across the globe, right? That's a day on which to celebrate the contributions of workers and to fight for the rights of workers and to fight to defend the rights of workers, May 1st. We're having an Ice Out March for Humanity, calling it the March for Humanity, Friday, May 1st, 3 p.m. in Hempstead. And if you all have a group, student group, friends, that want to organize and bring a little Hofstra contingent, I say little, it can be large, Hofstra contingent, to show solidarity with the immigrant community in Hempstead. I think it's a great opportunity. We've done marches in different locations, and we see sometimes when we're marching by where people live, we see people coming out and thanking us for marching because they see the solidarity from community members. And so it's an important opportunity to show that solidarity visibly. And I think I will leave it there. That's a lot. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. You know, one of the things that I'm struck with when we were planning this day, there was a kind of, general theme of executive power. But I realized just in the course of the day how we're kind of siloed, into our particular area. So, earlier this morning when we were talking about, about foreign policy and the power to go to war, in one sense it was kind of the same just structurally, which is that the Founding Fathers divided powers because they wanted to make sure that you would not have a king-like person, especially a king-like person with no brain, whoever that would be. But they, that it was very important that that Congress retains certain powers, and in the area of war and peace. And part of what we're talking about this morning is that actually how much that's eroded, and for a variety of reasons, and how you now have executive overreach. And I'm just really struck with both of your talks, and of course that's the same thing. Which, why didn't we realize that from the beginning of the day, right? Which is that part of what's happening is that we have an executive power that's making things much worse, right? And if I'm hearing you correctly, that you're also saying it's not like things were perfect before, but it sounds like both of you are saying there's really a qualitative deterioration that's gone on. I don't know if you want to add to that.
I just want to add a couple things. One, that there is intentional lawlessness by our government. They are intentionally doing unlawful actions in many areas, but definitely in the area of immigration. And the policies that are being directed, even apart from the executive orders, are policies that are themselves unlawful, or they may not look unlawful on the face. However, they contradict laws, and executive, policies aren't allowed to contradict the law. So in asylum, you have a right to apply for asylum at the border of the United States, but they're not letting anyone approach the border, which kind of takes away the ability, that right that is in the statute. If somebody has entered the United States legally or illegally, they're allowed to apply for asylum. Well, but we had that whole period where people who had entered the United States legally, in most part, were picked up and deported before they had a chance for any hearing, and sent to prisons. Like we all know about the CCAT, people sent to CCAT. They were not the only ones, and many people are still never having gone to a hearing in prison in a country they had never been to. One of the cases that I was following was there was a gay hairdresser from Venezuela, and because, I don't know, they were looking at things like, does someone have a tattoo? Yeah, but an autism tattoo is very different than a gang tattoo. Like the autism tattoo is not suggesting danger. This hairdresser had a heart with his mom's name in it, and he was sent to CCAT and was there for months, and it's one of the worst human rights abusing prisons in the world. It's known for that, and we did that to him. Like he fled his country because of persecution on account of his sexual orientation, and we sent him to a prison to be beaten and raped, and just incredible cruelty. And that was done on purpose. It wasn't that they really thought everyone on those planes was a gang member. Because if they're only sending people who actually are gang members, that doesn't scare people away from coming. Mm-hmm. Right? But if there's only a handful of gang members and everyone else are just regular, asylum seekers, so if I flee this person trying to kill me and go to the United States, maybe they're going to grab me and send me to a terror prison anyhow. So they're trying to do things that scare people away from coming. And, people often are fleeing death or, harm to their children. It takes a lot to be worse than that fear. And so we are just getting progressively more cruel and more cruel in how we deal with people in order to try to scare them away from coming. And not only is that unlawful, we have laws and statutes and regulations about what is supposed to happen if someone applies for asylum, and they're all being broken, and we're being sued for it, and many of the people will win, and we'll also pay them millions of dollars probably, and they should win. We have harmed them terribly. But it also speaks to who we are as a people, and who our national identity is, and what we allow our government to do in our name. And just one other thing, Nadia was talking about the illegal arrests and the Fourth Amendment rights. One of the issues also is there's so little accountability. So even when there has been a Fourth Amendment right, that arrest was illegal, the person didn't have probable cause, the law enforcement person didn't have probable cause, usually that doesn't end removal proceedings against the person. You can suppress some evidence sometimes, but they're still in removal proceedings. So that means what that says to law enforcement, unless it's very egregious. If it's very egregious, sometimes you can terminate removal proceedings, but it's hard. But to law enforcement, that means I can break the law, and if the person ends up being undocumented, they're in removal proceedings anyhow. I got what I wanted. And we've seen this over and over again with brutal actions taken that to me seem like that person should be prosecuted, the killing of protesters and stuff like that, but also in the arrests of immigrants. People are masked, we don't know their names, and the federal government is hiding their names. It makes it very hard to sue and try to hold somebody accountable if the federal government is refusing to tell us who they are.
One question I wanted to ask, because I'm from the People's Republic of Brooklyn, so it's different. But, and even though I've been at a school for forever, I think I still don't understand the politics of Long Island. But I'd like to ask really both of you about your sense of this. In other words, how powerful politically is it still that there's so much anti-immigrant feeling here? Or do you feel like there's a change? I just don't have a sense at all about, the direction in which public opinion has moved, or whether these very tough policies that President Trump has facilitated, has that actually produced some rethinking on the part of people? I wonder what both of your sense of that is.
I mean, my thought is that they're immigration advocates long ago lost the public opinion war, the war on public, trying to get public opinion, which honestly is startling to me because I feel religiously and morally and many other ways, how could you not see this side as a side that's trying to do right, at least. But the depiction of the border, which essentially has been fictionalized in many ways in the media. So I actually think there's a lot of people who don't think that immigrants should be treated how they're being treated now, that the violence against immigrants is wrong, and the violence against protesters is wrong, but that doesn't mean they're pro-immigrant now. They still think, but there's that problem at the border, and I did think that needed to be stopped. So I think opinion has shifted a lot against, say, ICE, and about a lot of the more violent things that are going on, and I think there are many things that change that, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to then translate that to, and I think, immigrants should be treated humanely and given the chance to go through the asylum process and due process rights necessarily.
Maybe I would add to that. I do think that in general, the pro-immigrant side has not had a lot of support, and that's demonstrated by the fact that we have had 30 years without any kind of comprehensive immigration reform, and that's been sort of the big legislative push at the federal level. On the other hand, Trump came into office winning right, on his anti-immigrant mass deportations platform, right? That was the platform. That was the signs, right, in his campaign. And now they are trying not to use the words mass deportation because they're realizing that that is something that people don't like, and people have begun to see how violent that is, that the mass deportations is not something that is going to happen unless they're doing what they were doing, which is picking people up brutally and at random. And that change, like, so you can see like public, they've had public opinion polls where you sort of see kind of how people are seeing Trump's handling of immigration and how he's basically losing on that. He's been losing credibility. That would not have happened without, I think, Minneapolis in particular, but without people organizing in defense of immigrants in every single part of the country, right? I mean, one of the big pushes has been, it's interesting, speaking of education, right, has, since the beginning, since the administration came in, one of the big pushes that every organization did has been know your rights, right? Know your rights education. You don't have to answer questions. You can remain silent. Don't open the door. Ask for a judicial warrant, right? That's something that everybody has repeated. And that has been so effective, I think, that it has been so effective that it made the job of ICE more difficult, so that they would go to doors and people using their constitutional rights would actually keep the door closed, right? Right now, many people will not open the door, right? They keep the door closed. They know that you need a judicial warrant. And so that made their life more difficult, right? That made ICE's efforts more difficult. And so I think that there's an ongoing connection between what the sort of the push is and also what it is that they're trying to do. And then I think the last thing that I'll say on that is that many people think, so some of those people who maybe they voted for Trump and now they're saying, oh my goodness, but this is too much, right? We didn't think it was going to be this bad. Many people actually think that there is a pathway. I've had people ask me, I don't know, maybe some of you in the audience think that for an immigrant who came to the country, hasn't committed any crimes, that if they've been here for 20 years, there must be some way for them to legalize, right? Like people say, well, why haven't they just gotten their papers, right? Like I've had that question, and it's because many people believe it's just, people don't know. People don't know how complicated the immigration system is. So they believe it must be more rational than the reality, which is that it's insane, right? And so I think that in some ways, these sort of politics, right? The mass deportation politics preys on people's ignorance, right? That the fact that people don't know that, and that if there were an opportunity for something that was actually sensible, that many people, like I said, they would actually, they actually think it already exists, right? So people are very supportive, but our national politics is not such that anything is going to pass. Yeah, that's more political.
I want to have some opportunity for students to make comments, ask questions. I think we have mics on both sides, so don't be shy about.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just wondering, and this might be a side issue to this, but like 2 years ago or so, there's been a lot of concern that the Trump administration is deporting students who are speaking out on the war in Gaza. And how's that played into like deporting international students for publishing unfavorable articles or as such?
Could everybody hear that question back in the?
Yeah, he's Mike.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's kind of a good part and a bad part to my response. So first off, they're still doing it. They're scrutinizing public social media, trying to find anything that, and both USCIS and ICE are calling anything that is seen as pro-Palestinian to be anti-Semitic. There have been a number, the cases again that get to habeas corpus are winning normally, and so that's the good news. Trump or the government is punishing the judges who rule in favor of them, and actually recently and I'm now forgetting her name, the tough student. But anyway, the judge who ruled in her favor, the immigration judge who ruled in her favor was fired. Another judge who ruled in favor of another student was fired. So judges are facing, immigration judges, it's pretty easy to fire, as it turns out. They actually are firing all the judges who grant cases and putting in people with no immigration experience into immigration court. So this week, 2 of my judges were fired, people with 20 years or so of expertise, and we'll get somebody with no experience who then will likely do whatever they're told to do because they don't know the law. So it's still going on. The courts have been good on it. However, the federal district courts have been good on it. Again, you come to how many people have an attorney to do the habeas litigation. And also, international students are often not coming now because who wants to pay a lot of money to be treated like this? I've definitely heard of a couple students who, when they realized they might be in trouble, just went home and they didn't want to be in detention. They would rather leave than maybe potentially spend several months in detention. The good news is that the federal courts are usually upholding the law and saying, no, this doesn't make this person deportable. Some of the universities have been better than others. Tufts made a statement that she had not, the student had not violated the visa in any way and that she was still in valid student status and therefore should not be deported. My alma mater, which is Columbia,
Less said about Columbia.
was not as supportive, shall we say. I don't mean to make a joke about it. They've treated some of their students very, very badly.
Right. I wasn't really making a joke.
No, I was talking about myself. So I said it wasn't supportive, and it's far worse than not supportive.
It's interesting in terms of Columbia. I actually was a doctoral student at Columbia during 1968. And the contrast really between then and now is very extreme. I mean, students occupied 5 buildings there and shut down education for an entire week. And they got mad, and there were some arrests, but almost nobody paid any long-term consequences for that at all. None. There was threats, we'll take your money away. They didn't do it. But the way that Columbia has responded now is really, it's really totally different level of repression.
I would say also that any immigrant, not just students, should be going through their social media and recognizing that it's going to be scrutinized and making the decision, do I want to keep this and fight about it if there is something that is likely going to be problematic? Because it is very common that they're searching social media now. And they will, keeping it private isn't enough. They'll say, show me your social media account, and we'll make an adverse inference if you refuse to show it to them.
Sorry, just a quick one, not to drag it out with me, but it seems just kind of surprising to me, if we're talking about separation of powers and the judiciary branch, how easy it is to fire judges for rulings you don't like.
So you're bringing up an issue that in immigration is a big deal. So immigration judges are administrative judges. So they're hired and fired within the executive branch. So immigration court, so the initial people hearing it, or immigration adjudicators, those will be under the power, of cabinets and positions and stuff, and so therefore will be executive. District court judges can't be fired that easily, which is why you see the habeas petitions. The immigration judges said, no, you can detain those. We're not going to grant bond, or I don't have jurisdiction to consider your case. The habeas judges, the district court judges are saying, you can't hold this person. And one of the reasons for that is that the immigration judges know they're going to be fired if they do it, but the district court judges will not be.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? I'm just leaving space. Yeah, any further student comments at this point? So I have a student question. Oh, I'm sorry. Yuki, go ahead.
You go.
I'm unsure whether this is, I'm Yuki Terazawa. I teach Japanese history in the history department. I'm not sure if this is an appropriate question, but if Democrats win the midterm election, would the situation become, somewhat better? Or in what ways it would improve and in what ways it would not improve?
There are so many possibilities, would they try to impeach Trump or something versus would they try to control executive actions that have exceeded what is lawful? I believe it absolutely would change, from my perspective, certainly for the better, if Democrats win in the midterms. How much it would change will really depend on how bold the Democrats are. And they don't have a history of being as bold as they could be in terms of making some change.
Maybe I would just add to that. Agreed. And the other thing is that after the midterms, even if Democrats are sort of making some moves to try to restrain the executive, at that point, Trump doesn't need to think about elections anymore, to be reelected or to think about anybody else's election. And so then it's free reign.
I've heard him talking about a third term.
Right.
Just
right.
saying.
Well, maybe.
Yeah.
But then it's free reign. I mean, if he's had free reign now, right, more or less, at that point, it seems, from the pessimist side, it seems that, other things that maybe he hasn't done until now, or I should, the other person to take into account is Stephen Miller, right? Other plans that maybe they haven't deployed until now could be deployed then, because in the last 2 years of his administration, maybe he doesn't have to worry about elections or how they're going to affect the party. So I don't know. We don't know. Meanwhile, we still need to organize.
Yeah, I just want to ask a follow-up, actually. It kind of pertains to this question. Do you see, just given the question that came up about the judicial power, right, the firing of judges, right, and the different system that's in place for immigration, do you see a need for a change, kind of restriction of power? Is this a matter, I guess, of the individual or the office? And so if it's the individual, then is it kind of primarily a position of kind of pushback, right? Protest, challenges, so forth? Or do you think that there is a need for a change in executive power on immigration policy?
So first, immigration judges should be moved so that they are actual judges and not administrative judges. Because right now, I think this is not, during my professional career, this has not been the case that judges were so at the whim of an extremely biased executive and attorney general. But every judge I'm in front of right now is very aware the question is it important enough for me to grant this? Because I'm going to get fired if I do. And unfortunately, like I said, that has happened. In terms of the executive power, that's actually not my area of expertise. However, I would say the real ballooning in executive orders, I think, is really problematic. The whole idea that we're doing so much law, not from Congress, but from the president. And of course, Trump isn't the first one to use executive orders. It's just he has done such a high number of them. But I also think we are in an unusual situation where Congress has just rolled over completely on almost everything. And so it's I don't know how, if you have two of the separate parts that are supposed to check each other, but instead one of them is saying, you do whatever you want. That's maybe even a bigger problem with Congress than it is with the president.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if, just as a concluding question, I mean, is really my question is how can students be involved, or what role can be played? So obviously, if you're a law student, that's less complicated. There's a host of things you could presumably be a part of. But are there ways for people that are concerned about these issues, which have become much more dramatic, really? If you think about Minneapolis and what just happened there, I think there's a lot more concern than there's been before. Are there ways that people can play students can play a constructive role right now?
You can say. Yes. Definitely have to vote. Agreed.
Yeah. In addition to that, I think I mentioned before a couple of things. I'll add a little bit more. There are multiple organizations that are doing all kinds of work, and this includes some of that rapid response and ICE Watch monitoring. As I said, it's like right here in Hempstead and Uniondale. There have been multiple, there is ongoing, I should say, ICE presence, and so supporting people. Another form of organizing and response has been to accompany families, right? So to help families who are facing this, maybe have a family member who's been detained. And people have done fundraising to support those families for legal support, or just helping, organize to get people rides and helping accompany them to a court, et cetera. So there are multiple ways. It has a lot to do with like connecting, I think. It's important to make that connection with local organizations and groups, and then also, organizing. I mentioned it sort of very quickly, but if there are student groups, for example, that are already organizing and in these some of these areas, I mentioned the May 1st March as kind of an easy way to begin to make those connections here in this area.
Also, just in general, be a witness. If you're walking or driving down the street and you see ICE stopping somebody, pull out your camera and record them. Don't interfere. You will get arrested if you actually interfere. But it is completely legal for you to stand there and record. Best case scenario, get out of the car so that you can actually pick out what's being said and stuff like that, or at least open your windows. But even if you're sitting there recording, it makes a difference. People act differently when they know they're on camera. And things are so bad that people will still commit grave human rights abuses when on camera, but they're still probably acting better than they would if they didn't know that they were on camera. Listen to what community groups are saying, so that, I see a lot of students have like the ice whistles to blow if they see ice. Listen to community groups and see what they want. Sometimes someone's trying to find out who the person is before they got taken away, and maybe they don't want you blowing a whistle in their ear as they're trying to find out the name so that they can tell the family or something. But really try to check in with the groups about what's going on. I will say, and I'm mainly dealing with law students, but I have law students running into my office sometimes who are not my students saying, there's a car I think might be ICE, can you come and check it out? I love that the students are doing that. So far it hasn't been ICE, which I'm thankful for. But to me, to know that there are students looking out thinking, why is that car that looks suspiciously dark and like with a person, two people in there looking around, why is that parked by our campus, which is also near an elementary school that has a lot of Latino students in it? Care about your neighbors and stop and be a witness if anything is happening to them.
So I really want to thank both of you. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. All right, I'm rescinding my thank you for the next 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are, I think, about what's likely to happen after the election. First of all, it's likely to be a landslide election, which will tend to weaken Trump. He's a lame duck already, so he's not going to be more of a lame duck. And then also, a lot of the people that you see running on the Democratic side are, somewhat different than, the old guard have been, who were more timid and so on. A lot of them are ex-military. They seem to be on the one side practical, but on the other side, idealistic as well, who may want to take up the mantle and let's make things different. This is what the legislature's for. But whatever they do, if there's a landslide Democratic election, they're going to impeach Trump, and the Democratic Congress now has the power of investigation, and they're going to investigate the hell out of absolutely everything that they've been doing, and all of that is going to weaken Trump more. He may get crazier, but it's going to weaken him politically. But just, one other thing, I sat through, the whole day on this, and the whole theme seems to be, where does it all start? Voting. Hofstra pushes the heck out of this, and everybody here is going to vote, I'm sure, okay? But what about the 50%?
If you're a citizen.
But, what about the 50% that don't vote? And what about all of the people who don't go to college and never went to college and don't think that voting has any relevance to them? And and you talk to them, it doesn't apply to me. So that gets down to, we got to do more about civic education and impressing upon people who never go any further than high school, that citizenship is critical, and that's how you make things change, and that they do apply to you, in so many ways that they don't. And somehow civics courses have to make that blatantly clear so that you get a movement off the dime where, in this Hungarian election, 77% voted. Duh, well, why not here, It's the same type of a situation.
I will just add there that political parties, and I'm thinking particularly of the Democrats based on what we're saying, need to run candidates who appeal to young people and who appeal to the people who are not voting that we have seen. If you look at New York City, a campaign that specifically reached out to people who were not voting had very high turnout. So part of it also is thinking about how do we build leaders who can connect.
And maybe add to that, just the fact that, one of the things I think that keeps people from voting is that people see the reality, which is that many times Congress people aren't representing the interests of the people, of their voters, of their constituents. They're representing corporations, they're representing their donors, and there are so many issues, healthcare is the one that always pops up, but there are many others where if you look at what it is that people want, it's very clear, but if you look at what the representatives are voting for, it's the opposite, right? And so there are, I think there have been studies about how the political system as it is, they're not representing what the people who vote them in would actually like to happen. And I think that contributes, that disillusion, that lack of seeing something happen contributes to the fact that people don't vote, you know? And I think that needs to change as much as sort of the, you know, obviously the education as well needs to happen.
I'm going to start my thank you again. You know, everything that you've been talking about is really important and really interesting. And this is an enormous issue, right? I mean, I'm sure, you know, a lot of you sitting there aren't saying things, but I'm sure that the gravity of what we're talking about is profound. And it actually does summon all of us in some way or other to figure out how we make things better. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come and meet with us today, and I'm happy to have met you as well. So thank you very much. And
Thank you so much.